Okay, so I'm going to ask that you forgive me this morning because I'm going to start off with one of the oldest, most overused sermon illustrations of all time. But it just fit really well. I just had to use it. So here we go. A devout Christian was caught in a flood one day, and he climbed up onto the roof of his house as the water started to rise and started to lap over the roof, and the edge of the roof, and he prayed, "Lord, please deliver me from this flood." And the water continued to rise, and a policeman came rowing by in a boat, and he said, "Can I help you? Come on in." And he says, "No thanks, the Lord will deliver me." Okay, so he rowed on. And then a little while later, the water gets even higher, and the Christian is up to his waist, standing on the roof, and a lifeboat cruises by, and the rescuer shouts out, "Come on, get in the boat, I'll take you to safety." "No thanks," is his reply. "The Lord's going to deliver me. Don't worry about it. I prayed for it." So he goes on. A few minutes later, it's risen so high that all that's left is his eyes. His eyes are over the water. He's peeping out like that. He's on his tiptoes, and a helicopter comes by and drops a rope to him. And he says, "Grab the rope, I'll pull you out." And he kind of pops his mouth up there, and he says, "No thanks, the Lord will deliver me." At which point the water raises over his head and he drowns. So then he arrives at the pearly gates in heaven, and he goes to St. Peter, and he's furious. And he says, "I've been a serious and devout Christian all my life, devoted to prayer and good works. Why didn't God answer my prayers?" And Peter says, "That's weird. We sent 2 boats and a helicopter after you." Okay, so we're at the conclusion of our Speaking of Love series. We've been discussing the 5 love languages, which is a concept developed by Gary Chapman. We spent 2 weeks talking about how to love other people by understanding their love language. And during that time, we were focused on the positive aspects of the love languages. And those are the ones that are specifically addressed by Chapman in his books. Then we shifted directions, and we started looking at the dissenting opinions concerning love languages. And these are views by people who see the love languages as bad or even dangerous. So last week, we looked at the first aspect of this dissension by talking about one of Gary Chapman's core concepts of love languages, which is that we all have a love tank. We have a love tank that needs to be filled. And then we showed how that idea can unfortunately lead to some distorted and dangerous versions of our love languages. The result is that the love languages can morph into the 7 deadly sins. They become ravenous and insatiable, and feeding the sin only continues to make the matter worse. Today, we're going to look at the bigger, overarching disagreement that some people have concerning these love languages. And that is that the love languages do not depend on God. Instead, they are only focused on relationships between people and the love that one person gives to another. It really doesn't have much to say about the love that we receive from God or how following Christ changes our concept of love. From the perspective of this dissension, there are 4 main arguments made against the love languages. And they are, number 1, the love languages only teach us how to love as everyone else does, as the sinners do, instead of how to love as Christ has asked us to. Number 2, our self-seeking nature prevents us from loving, and this can only be rectified by coming to Christ. 3, love languages put our wholeness in the hands of other people. We rely on other people to make us whole. And their wholeness is in our hands as well, leaving God completely out of the equation. And then finally, the desires listed in the love languages, the love languages themselves, are actually sinful and must be overcome by being fulfilled through the love of Christ. So we're going to go through those 4 points. To understand the first point, we turn to Matthew 5, line 46. "For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You therefore must be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect. It's certainly true that love languages do somewhat embrace a I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine sort of mentality. I'll work to fill your love tank, and I'll hope that you would work to fill my love tank as well. And there's always this hope of a reciprocity going on in the background. Jesus specifically tells us here that if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? That's not the point. The broader context of that scripture is that we are called to love our enemies even. And if we love our enemies in the hopes of them loving us back, we're going to be quite disappointed. But the people who fight against love languages on this basis tend to take the argument a bit to the extreme. They feel that teaching people to love, as the tax collectors do, is pointing them in entirely the wrong direction. And instead, people must seek to understand the love of Christ first. And only after understanding love in that way can they love at all. Teaching any lesser kind of love is only going to cause harm. Now, truly, I would be ecstatic if all people could learn to love through Christ's sacrifice for us. If we could all love one another in such a selfless way, think of the amazing things we could accomplish. But what if somebody doesn't understand God's love? What if they have no concept of God's sacrificial love? Should they just give up on understanding love if they don't understand that? This stance, this argument against the love languages would have us learn to run before we learn to walk. It would have us learn calculus before we learn addition. It would have us read Shakespeare before we can read The Cat in the Hat. We do not start with an intrinsic knowledge of God's love. Many people may not know or understand or appreciate God's love for much of their lives. But apparently, if you can't come to and understand the fullness of God's love, then you have no business trying to love at all. You're just going to muck it up anyway. I hope the atheists don't take note of this idea, lest much of the population suddenly just give up and turn sullen and resentful. I agree that we're all called to a greater love than we find in the pages of Chapman's book, but he never intended the love languages to be the end-all and be-all of love. They're simply a tool for you to use to help love others better. Can the tool be used improperly? Sure, any tool can. But for those who don't happen to know God and His love, I would rather that they take the baby steps of learning to love in some way rather than give up on understanding love at all. Often I feel that people will see the first glimpses of the possibilities of God's love through the love of others, be they Christians or not. Our second point is related to the first. The love languages focus on and promote our self-seeking nature. And this prevents us from loving other people. Those who use this argument against the love languages point out that our real goal should be to seek God. If we follow Christ, then we will no longer be self-seeking, but will do His will and love in a purely sacrificial way as He did. Now, I'm sorry to burst your bubble on this one, but I'm going to clue you into something. Even if you're a Christian, you're still self-seeking. And if you think I'm full of it, then I want you to think for a moment, why are you a Christian? If you were to call other people to Christ, if you were to get a bunch of random people together and say, you should follow Christ, what are you doing not doing that? Come to Christ. Why should they do that? Does it have anything to do with salvation? If so, that's very interesting. Let me put it this way. Let's say that following Christ and doing what was morally right gained you nothing. Even more, let's say that those who do evil in life will have a good life. And when they die, they'll go to a wonderful heavenly place. And let's say that you, when you do anything that is good and right, you'll be rewarded with a toothache. Every person you help, every hungry mouth you feed, every hated person you love, toothache. Toothache for you. And when you die, you go to a fiery place of punishment. How excited are you to follow that religion? Sign me up. Sign me up twice, right? Now, you may think that you would righteously sacrifice yourself anyway. I will do what's morally right no matter what. Give it a few toothaches and see how you feel about that. Man, I hate toothaches. They're the worst. We as Christians expect that we will be rewarded. And we see this plainly laid out for us. Hebrews 11, line 6. It says, "And without faith it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him." You as a Christian are self-seeking. You seek the rewards that God gives you, and you'd be a fool not to. Receiving the Spirit did not make you less self-seeking. It just changed your idea of what will truly do you the most good. To gain your life, you must lose it. Certainly you are called to love in a sacrificial way, but do not think that it makes you a great person for doing that. You're not doing it because you're wonderful. You're doing it because Christ asked you to and has promised that it will benefit you later. It might benefit you now, but it'll benefit you later. Store up your treasures in heaven. The Father has a place waiting for you. Christ went to prepare a place for you, etc. And I understand that some people at some times have performed acts that seem utterly, completely selfless. But honestly, the way it seems to me, the only really selfless people are those who don't believe in God at all. Because what do they have to gain? If a Christian sacrifices himself to save another, then he has his reward. If a non-Christian does it, what reward does he have? So disregarding the love languages simply because they can seem to be self-seeking and not teach the sacrificial love of Christ, that seems to be a fairly moot point to me. Third point. The love languages place the responsibility of making others whole in our hands. And our wholeness is placed in other people's hands. Now, I agree that this can be a problem. I could see a very frustrated parent trying to find just the right love language to bring their teenager back on the right track. And they just hit obstacle after obstacle after obstacle. They just can't seem to find the right path. And if all you have is the love languages to go by, then you're going to take this as personal failure. Your teen has a love tank, you should be filling it, and you can't seem to do it. And your own love tank needs to be filled as well. And you can't find anyone else to fill it. Are you simply sentenced to misery because no other person can meet all your needs? For those who know God, they know that He has a plan for us. We seldom understand what the plan is, but that's okay. We understand that He knows these things. Maybe that relationship you're working on and struggling with, maybe it wasn't meant to be. Maybe it's not in the cards. It's not in the plan. God might have a different plan for you. Maybe someone else is meant to fill that love tank or fill that spot in your life. Maybe God is purposely keeping discomfort in your life so that you will turn to Him. We don't like to think about that, but it could be. And if you can accept that, if you can accept that idea and embrace it, then maybe you can avoid some hurt and frustration because you realize that life is bigger than just you. It's bigger than just the other person who you're trying to make whole or who you're expecting to make you whole. As far as love languages are concerned, one should understand that the entirety of your happiness is not going to come from other people. And they should not try to find all of their happiness and wholeness in you. If you're in that situation, understand that eventually you are going to be disappointed. You're going to be disappointed, you're going to be disillusioned when you realize that you and the other person are simply too imperfect to make that work. So in that case, I do believe that we really do need to bring God in on that equation and recognize Him. Final point. And this is the point that says that our needs, basically the actual love languages themselves, that need of touch, service, all that stuff, they are sinful desires that need to be overcome. It's not that love languages can go bad, like we talked about last week. It's that they are bad. They are bad from the very beginning. They are sinful from the beginning. And I couldn't help but think of Corinthians when I contemplated this point. The Corinthians, some of them anyway, had a similar idea that they were working off of. They desired to be spiritual people. They wanted to be above all of that. They wanted to be very spiritual. And one of the ways they were doing this is that husbands and wives, they were withholding physical intimacy from each other. They were above that. That's fleshy stuff. That's not spiritual. So they were staying apart. And I'm sure that the people who make these arguments against the love languages, they cheer that on. Yeah, good for you. Be spiritual. Stay away from that sin. And yet Paul says this to them, 1 Corinthians 7, line 3. He says, the husband should give his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. But then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So Paul does not tell them to cast off those needs and desires. He does tell them at a later point, at another point in the letter, he tells them that they need to use those desires properly and to not fall into immorality. Certainly he says that. And that's what we spoke of last week, that you must find a proper balance in the love languages to keep them from turning into sins. But I hold that the original need is not sinful in itself. We may turn it sinful by our selfishness, but to desire love and to properly fulfill love is not a sin. Wanting to be acknowledged and valued, which is what love is all about, really, being acknowledged and valued. Wanting that is not a sin. If it were, prayer would be of no value. Prayer would be utterly useless. Because prayer is based on the idea that God will acknowledge you, acknowledge your prayer, and value you enough to listen. If wanting to be valued and acknowledged was something you shouldn't do, prayer would be totally useless. You wouldn't do it. If God had not given us needs, if He had not given us these desires, we would never come to know Him at all. We would have no need to. Our desires are not sins, but they can easily become them. Now, all of those arguments against the love languages bring me to some major points that I want you to consider. We say that God is love, but all too often I feel that some Christians think of God as magic. These dissenters against love languages do so not because the technical aspects of the love languages are inherently wrong. It's not that they don't work. It's because God should be filling that need instead. You shouldn't be getting it from other people. You should be getting it from God. You shouldn't be focusing on those needs anyway because they're just sinful desires. Instead, all you need is God. Seek ye first the kingdom, and all these things will be added unto you, right? How are they added? How are they added unto you? Magic, apparently. It's magic. Learn to love God, and all your worries disappear. All your needs will be fulfilled. You won't have to rely on anyone else ever again. Now, when I say it that way, it sounds a little bit silly. But then again, it seems almost unchristian for me to say that seeking God isn't the answer to all your problems. So we have this weird comparison there. But let's think upon the illustration I started the message with. The Christian is on the roof of his house, and that Christian is the person I'm talking about right now. The person who cannot see God in a practical sense, but only in a theological sense. This is the woman I spoke about last week. The woman who didn't like love languages because she didn't want to love in a human way. Instead, she loves only as God loves. Her pride would never let her accept the help of the man in the boat or in the helicopter, because God would never work in such a mundane way in her life. Not for her. He would deliver her personally. But God does work in mundane ways, and those ways are you and me. we're mundane. We are the instruments of His love, expressions of His love, and I would like to perform that job to the best of my abilities. Like any good worker, I am going to use every tool at my disposal to make that better. And that's what the love languages are. They're a tool. A tool to help you build relationships with each other and to share the love of Christ with them. Now, there is an illustration that C.S. Lewis uses concerning morality, and I find it to be relevant to this topic, and I just really like the illustration. Anyway, imagine that we are all ships sailing in a formation. We must understand how to communicate and relate to each other, or else we are going to crash into each other. This is what we usually think about concerning morality, how we affect our fellow man, what we do, how it affects them. Do we hurt them? Do we help them? But there's something else of importance too. How well are the internal workings of each ship? This speaks to our internal moral compass. If you let your love language run amok within you, as we spoke of last week, then you're going to lose control of your ship and you're going to have collisions. So not only do you have to communicate well with the other ships, you have to keep your ship working well. If you can't control your own ship, you're going to crash. Or if you're constantly crashing into other ships, it's going to damage you at some point, and your internal workings won't work so well. So you have to keep both of those things in mind. We have to ensure that they both work together. And the love languages are a tool to help us do that. But there's one more thing we're forgetting. Where are the ships going? Where are the ships going? As Lewis says when he makes this comparison, however well the fleet sailed, its voyage would be a failure if it were meant to reach New York and actually arrived at Calcutta. It is God that gives direction to the fleet. As Christians, we have been given a course heading, and we are sticking to it. But that doesn't make the internal workings of the ship or the relationship between the ships any less relevant. Instead, it takes those relationships and gives them purpose and meaning. I said you must maintain a balance to keep your love language from turning bad. How do you know when you have the right balance? How do you know when it's in its proper form or if it's gone wild? You can't use yourself as a standard because your language could be all out of whack. And you can't use someone else as the standard because their love language could be all out of whack. What you need is something to guide you. You need a standard. You need God. The love languages can find practical use in the hands of anyone, but they can only be perfected in the hands of those who seek God. Not that you'll be perfect or that your relationships will be perfect, but your aim will be perfect. Your destination will be perfect. And you can spend the rest of your life working towards perfection, steering your ships, keeping them healthy on the inside, keeping good communications with those around you, so that in the end, you will have used the tools at your disposal to accomplish the mission our captain has set for each of us. You have loved. You have loved the best that you could to as many people as you could. And those people, we hope, know Christ better because they saw Him in you.